Hi everyone, thank you for being here. We're so excited to have Katie Spragg, an artist and ceramicist, with Annie Warburton today. Annie and Katie go back a few years. Annie showed Katie's work when she was in the Crafts Council at the Design Academy, so there's some interesting conversation that we're looking forward to, just purely because not just of the knowledge they have of each other, but Annie's expertise in the craft and the industry. And I want to let you guys enjoy this evening. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Verena.
Thank you.
And good evening, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to be here in conversation with Katie. Thank you, Verena, for inviting me to host this talk. As Verena said, I go back a long way with Katie. In fact, I first came across your work when you were graduating from the Royal College of Art. And at that time, and still, you were working very much in animation as well as in clay. And I'm going to pick up the theme of animation later in the talk, but I was really struck by your stop motion animations, and I think the first time we actually worked together was I showed Katie's animations in a festival called Reel to Reel, which was a craft film festival. And then, as Verena says, we went on to exhibit Katie's work as part of Miami Art Week, and it was really wonderful because at the time you were making hamstones and you had wild plants, kind of British wild plants, rendered in clay, and having these exquisite, delicate works in the brightness and sun of Florida was quite remarkable. Katie is an artist whose work spans many different practices, yes animation, yes clay, also site-specific work and socially engaged work, and I'm sure we're going to hear about all of those flavours. And Katie's also worked in many different places, in Somerset, in Menorca, in the Cairngorms, in Iceland and in Lambeth, among others. But despite this diversity of place and the diversity of range of practice, there are some themes that I think run through your work. One thing that you have in common, all your work, is that your work is, to my eye, are portraits in clay of peoples and of place, and the connections between people and place. Secondly, really importantly, your work is an evocation of process. When we talk about craft, we're often very much focused on the object, but of course it's the story of the making that is behind that final object that is as important, and that's often captured in part in your animations. And finally, and again, I'm sure we'll end up touching on this, there's a deep quality of care that runs through your work. That's care in the making, that's care in the research, that's care for wild places and wild plants, and then from that, care for our own wild natures and care for the environment more broadly. So that's just a little flavour of what I see in your work, Katie. And how this is going to work is you're going to take us through some wonderful slides, talk about your work, and then we'll get into conversation. So over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Annie. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you because we have spoken about my work before, and I think there's a real understanding of what I'm doing. Just to say that we are talking within the context of this exhibition at Ruup Form, Porcelain Dreams. So I've focused my presentation on, some of the works in the exhibition, and I've kind of taken a journey through those chronologically. And because there's work going back to 2018, it's a really nice opportunity to kind of, as Annie mentioned, think about the themes that run all the way through what I do over a sort of 6-year period. So I've opened with this image, which is one of my favourite images to open presentations with, and I've been using this image since I graduated from Royal College of Art in 2016, and that was when I was making work that was about kind of peering into spaces. So there was that kind of very physical relationship there, but looking back at this image today, it made me think about, I'm interested in making people curious and look at kind of everyday things in a different way, but I also look at this image now and think about how much my work is about bringing different audiences to artwork and to making and to craft, and how that has become so prominent and important in my work. Whether that's like young children or people with dementia, thinking of ways of engaging them in both making and viewing art. And I think that's kind of what's so charming about this image, is that the young girls in it are approaching a gallery in a totally original way. So I just popped this slide in. This is an image of my studio. It's my studio that was in Bermondsey, which is sadly now demolished and being turned into luxury flats. But I think it's very good and representational of kind of the busyness of my studio and how I work, and how drawing and gathering is so important to that process of making. So I thought that was a nice one to open with. And then coming on to one of the artworks that is in the exhibition, Porcelain Dreams. This is a still from an animation called Cheese Grows Blue. And it was made originally in 2018 on a residency at Gullegaard International Ceramic Research Centre, which is in Denmark, about an hour and a half from Copenhagen. And it's the first animation that I made following the ones that I made during my MA. And so I was thinking about the importance of an artist residency as kind of space, time, funding for making work, and how that was so important for me to be able to kind of allocate these 6 weeks to that focused time. Because animation is something that feels very important to my practice, but practically it's actually quite challenging to do that in the kind of everyday way of making that I would normally. So I could take a little back room in the gallery space of the residency, block out all the windows because the light being consistent is very important when building animation, and then really delve into the research and the making. And this animation is called Cheese Grows Blue because it references a poem I wrote when I was about 7 that I'm actually going to treat you to the first ever live reading of that poem in a minute. But it is about the moon and the moon's place in our imagination and our literature and our poems, but also the way that the moon affects different plants. So this still is from a story, well, I'm calling it a story, but it's actually a scientific paper about how this particular plant that grows on the mountainsides of Greece will only release these drops of nectar on a full moon in June or July. I can't remember if it's June or July. And the way that the scientists had described these little drops of nectar was that they sparkled like diamonds in the moonlight. And I just loved that poetry of something scientific and that kind of blending of imagination and science and poetry. So these are some images from the residency space, and that small diamond in the middle that's mounted on sugar paper is that poem that I found. So I'm going to read it to you now. I think I focused a lot more on form. I was obviously very set on writing it in a diamond shape and maybe not so much on content. So please take that into consideration. Moon, shining, big white moon, glows in the night, glistening up in space. Astronauts discover, way up there the moon, circling the Earth, with the stars, cheese grows blue. So that's where the work got its title from. And then the final image is how the work was first presented at the end of the residency. So with the animation in the background and then some of the sets from the animation, so revealing some of that process of how things happened. So there's part of the animation where the moon kind of climbs up over behind the hills. And this piece on the end, you can see I had a big roll of paper, a porcelain moon stuck behind the paper and a light. And I was manually taking the paper up a tiny bit at a time to give the impression of the moon climbing. So part of the thing that I find really exciting about animation is all the kind of gaffer tape behind the scenes and things on sticks and leaning in and crouching over and getting backache from moving things a tiny bit. And for me, that's kind of part of the magic. And I've brought that into this exhibition as well. So there's 2 pieces where I've taken a moth, which is one of the characters from the animation, and brought that back out and presented that. And then there's a small piece that's kind of part of one of the scenes as well. So moving on to 2019, this is some work that's not in the exhibition, but I wanted to include it because it's kind of so important for the shape of my practice, and that is Lambeth Wilds, which was a project that I ran at the Garden Museum across around 9 months in 2019. And the reason it was so important was because it brought kind of historical and contemporary research of the museum collection together with what has now become a big part of my practice, which is engaging other people in making. So I worked with Lambeth Young Carers, which is a group of young people that have unpaid caring duties. And they came to the museum for 6 days and made their own stock frame animations, thinking about using wild plants as a metaphor for being a carer. And I was really unsure about how much those young people would connect to that idea, and they got really involved and they really kind of embraced it and were thinking about themes of sort of resilience and determination. And one of the things that I noticed in the botanical illustrations in the museum collection, you can just see poking through at the very bottom of this kind of concrete slab the roots of some of the plants. So I started making the roots as well, and that was a sort of metaphor for community and how it's so integral to the plant but might be hidden from view. And so the artwork is permanent artwork in the Garden Museum, but this book is something else I produced as part of the project that felt a really important way of sharing everybody's stories that contributed to the project, because it wasn't just the young carers. I also worked with the Clay for Dementia group that I worked with there, and we had lots of different members of the public coming in, and then lots of outreach that Janine, the head of learning at the Garden Museum, took some of the clay projects we were doing out into the wider community as well. And so I was asking people to share their stories of wild plants, and they're all featured in the book, as well as on this side is some of the young people's words that relate to care. So I really wanted their voices to be able to come through in the book. And every plant in the piece then references one of those stories that I collected. So then jumping forward a little bit to 2022, and these 2 artworks are in the exhibition. This work is the first work that I made following the birth of my daughter. She was born at the end of 2021, and so that was kind of very much on my mind. And these reference the Pete Rudolph Garden at House Ringworth, Somerset, so a place that I'd spent time previously, and then I was returning to somewhere that was familiar but with a very fresh perspective, and thinking about kind of how becoming a mother had changed my view of things. So thinking, when I visited the garden, it was kind of all tangled and crispy and wintry. It was in early March, so the piece on the left represents that, and then kind of thinking about memory of a place and returning to a place and how it changes. And the piece on the right is what that same area would have looked like when I last visited it in August 2020, and that kind of idea of time passing and how having a child might change your view of that. So this is me making the work in the studio while breastfeeding, which I didn't think making tiny, incredibly delicate things while breastfeeding would be possible, but when you have a deadline, it is possible. Mm-hmm. And looking back at these images, I'm still quite surprised that was the case. And then you kind of get a sense of how the work is constructed and some of the kind of clayiness and mess of the studio and some of my drawings in the background as well. And then these are some images from the garden, so some of those reference images and a series of tests I did to get the colours right. So this was maybe the very beginning of thinking about bringing colour into the work, and it's very tonal and earthy, and it references the colours of play. And these are the summer images. So this is a film image, a photograph. So thinking about working from photographs and how that kind of changes my perspective of things and how that kind of then connects with memory as well. And then around the same time, just after I made those works, I went on a residency to Iceland. So this was the Make residency, and there was around 18 different artists from North America and Europe who all work in clay. So this was like an amazing thing to go and do just as I was starting to think about rebuilding my practice after having my daughter, because many of them were parents and they were all kind of working in research or teaching or working in clay and just having those conversations. And I guess that's where that idea of conversation starts to come in and how important that is to, I guess, to many artists in terms of like having that community and that support. And for me, residencies are these really very special spaces where that happens, because you've all kind of come into the same situation. You're in somewhere that's new to you. And in this case, we were making work for a pop-up exhibition, so we had 2 weeks to kind of really, really quickly make some work. And so everything's quite immediate, and you can't really go to Iceland and not respond to the landscape there. So I was thinking about the changing light and the changing atmosphere, and you can see there's this kind of an island that's disappearing into the mist, and the view from the studio, you would be looking out the window and you might have like a view of a glacier and an island, and then you would look back a few minutes later and the weather had changed and the view had completely changed. So I became very interested in this, and I made a series of very quick animations on my phone. So again, using that opportunity of the residency to return to the animations. And then when I came back, I made a series of static sculptural works that related to the animations, but also kind of represented those places. And they were shown at Collect with Ruup Form. So I can share some of those animations at the end. Which brings me to the most recent project. So those of you in the gallery will have seen these pieces on the wall behind you. And these are a collection of works that were made in response to Menorca. So this was a part of a 3-site residency that I did with Hauser and Wirth last year. I went to the Cairngorms, which you mentioned, in Scotland, Menorca and Somerset. So 3 very different landscapes. But I wanted to show the Menorca work in this exhibition because it related back to the Mediterranean landscapes of the Cheese Grows Blue animation. So, and there's a kind of like dreaminess, I guess, in going to Menorca and visiting that landscape. But these particular pieces are called busti aloes, and the word busti is an old Scots word that means grass that is from the previous year that may be somewhat withered or kind of crispy, and I just thought that was such a magical word. And I was finding all these busti grasses in rural Scotland at the very, very beginning of spring, and then going to this completely different landscape and looking for busti grass or leaves in the Menorcan landscape, and thinking about climate and how these grasses are kind of dry and crispy for very different reasons. So this is the dead growth of the aloe plant from the previous year in the brown clay, and then the white porcelain represents that new growth. So these are some of the photos I took. This is the island that the Hauser and Wirth gallery is on, and the whole side of the island is just covered in prickly pears and aloe plants. So the plants become part of the texture of the landscape, which I found really interesting, and then a detailed shot of them, and then thinking, well, then how does that translate into an object and into clay? As Annie mentioned, a big kind of concern in my work is that idea of care and how plants care for us and how we can care for them. So I've become quite interested in the medicinal qualities of plants, and through this residency I met with 2 different herbalists who were sharing some of their amazing plant knowledge. So this picture here is of plantain, which is a really common plant here, and has loads of amazing healing properties, but it grows here as a weed in the UK, and this was planted in a medicinal garden. It's the first time I'd seen plantain purposely planted. And then this other plant is chamomile, but a very particular variety from Menorca. And I met a landscaper who took me on this amazing tour around the island, took me for lunch with his mum. I felt like I'd been really shown the island properly. And he told me that when he came to study landscape gardening in the UK, his mum sent him back with loads of bundles of Menorcan chamomile, which he sold at Borough Market, and that's how he paid his way through college.
Wow.
So I thought that was a great story, and so I made a piece to kind of represent that story. So thinking about scale, this piece here, it was very small, and that's representing this landscape, but again, kind of just starting to think about colour, and the Menorcan landscape was the colours were amazing, so I've just taken these little notes and tones of colour, and then this is the piece that represents the plantain and another type of chamomile, seaside chamomile. And part of that residency, although not in Menorca, but in Scotland and Somerset, was working with local people, so to collect their stories of plants and their relationship to the landscape. So I worked with primary school children in Braemar and Somerset, and families in Braemar, in the Cairngorms, and then adult carers. And a big part of the work I do when I'm working with other people is to take them out into the landscape. So kind of engaging them in the way that I work with place as an artist, so going out and observing and collecting things and then bringing that back to the studio to make with clay. So just rounding off my presentation with this slide, which is the programme that I run at the Garden Museum, which is called Clay for Dementia. And myself and Janine have been doing it for the last 7 years, which feels very special. And this is kind of very much where my focus has been recently, because I've just been writing a text about that work that's called Making With, and that idea of how I'm learning through working with people who have dementia, and they're learning through working with clay, and the kind of connections between that. Making With is referencing Donna Haraway, sympoiesis. So, but yeah, that's kind of where my head's been recently, and thinking about how that work that I do with people with dementia and then my own practice might start to come together a little more. So I'm finishing on this slide, which is from a vitrine in an exhibition at Howsam Worth last year into early this year, and this shows a collection of the different ways that I research, so drawing, collecting things, gathering things. These are some ceramics made by the children in the workshops, photographs, spider diagrams, the best representation of my brain, and then some of the colour samples that I've been working with. So I'll finish there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie. That was so rich. And actually, as you were taking us through it, I could smell the landscape or smell the wet clay. It was really evocative, so thank you. I know you've got some animations to show us, but before we get to that, maybe we'll pick up a couple of the things that you touched on there. And I think I might start with this idea of making with, and you spoke about Donna Haraway and her ideas of connecting people and the entwinement of humans and nature, and I love this phrase of Teilhard de Chardin, which is interdependent co-arising. So we're working together and we're creating each other through everything is relational. But sort of coming from that quite abstract thought in a way, right down to earth, what is it about clay that is so special about connecting us?
I think the thing that I always come back to is how easily transformable it is, that you can pick up a piece of clay and you've already changed it. It's already taken on your fingerprint, or you can squeeze it and it's instantly changeable. I did my undergraduate in wood, metals, ceramics and plastics, and that's 3 quite rigid materials and then 1 squidgy material, and it's the squidgy one that's stuck. And I think through the writing I've been doing recently, I've been thinking about what does clay afford me as an artist, but also the people that I work with, and I think it can easily replicate something else, so we can model it into something recognisable. It kind of connects us to something very basic, which is cooking and eating. There's lots of similarities between like rolling out clay, or rolling out dough or pastry, and modelling with it, and even the process of baking it, and that kind of. And then again, it's another process of transformation. Like, we transform the clay through our hands, and then the kiln transforms the clay into this completely different static thing.
Right, so let me pick up on that, because once the clay is being fired, as I say, it's static, it's fixed, so it's being so protean and responsive, and then suddenly it's fixed. And so much of your work, as I said at the beginning, to my eye, is a desire and attempt to convey the process as well as the final object. And I'm curious about that, which if you just showed the object without that story of process, would it have the same effect in your eyes?
I think it has a different effect, because a lot of my work does exist as sculpture and as something quite static, but that is what drew me to the animation, is that opportunity to share some of the tactility of clay and some of that kind of transformative quality in something that is kind of complete and finished, like a film. And
there's a story. So there's temporality to an animation, and there is behind the sculpture this temporality, but in itself it's there complete.
Yeah. I think it does something different, because I think the completeness and the kind of the presenting of that to an audience does something special, and I think there's that kind of, it makes something very permanent. And I guess when I come to working with other people, being able to kind of share something that's very finished and complete can be really satisfying for people that aren't normally creative.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet your piece is also, you've got the clods of earth there, which is, I don't know if I've seen any other artists show botanical work, certainly not in clay. And so to me, that you're communicating how we're earthed, how we're grounded, and actually the clay there is communicating the process still, because it is as though those plants are still growing.
Yeah, and I guess it has that clayness. It's like it's been grabbed from the bag.
Yeah. Which is so satisfying. I wish the people watching and listening to this talk could be here in the gallery and able to see that, because one has a physical, a haptic response to the work. It's not just visual, it's an embodied response to the work, I think.
That's very nice to hear.
So I'm curious about, you've been talking about process, but you yourself as an artist are going through a process in making, and perhaps you might pick up on one of the residencies or a particular piece of work about what you learn about yourself through making.
I think that's a very good and interesting question, particularly because I've just been in a very reflective phase through writing this text and thinking about what I learn. I think, I'm learning about a kind of patience and attention to detail that I wouldn't think of myself as having in other aspects of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I have dyspraxia and I make incredibly fragile, fine things, so there's something quite interesting happening there as well. I guess that for me the process of making is really about observation, and that's part of why I'm so excited of then running workshops with other people, because it's this kind of pause. And in terms of like botany and getting to understand plants, I'm working almost, although I don't think of myself as being scientific at all, almost scientifically to kind of dissect the plant and model it. And I guess you were talking about things in relation to each other. I'm thinking about relationships, so how plants might grow in compositions, like the scale of like a vast landscape, and then how that relates to like the fine detail of a stamen on a flower. And I think there's a lot of conversation at the moment about makers and slowing down and the importance of that, and like the urgency of slowing down. And I think I haven't made anything myself for a long time, for a few months, but when you're kind of exercising that focus, you do have to slow down.
I love this paradox of the urgent. We're in a hurry to slow down with the urgency of slowing down. But certainly your work, and we saw this in the slideshow, you're taking in large-scale landscapes, and then you're bringing our focus right down to the individual blade of grass or the stamen, and that then connects us with that sense of care, that sense of the preciousness. I think it's vital. We need it. It's necessary right now. Maybe shall we see one of the animations and then go into if that's possible and not too technically complicated, and then we'll pick up some of the themes.
So we'll just have to wait a minute for it to load.
Okay.
So these were animated on my phone, so they're very instant. This is really thinking about the shifting landscape of Iceland. They're very short. And very kind of playful and experimental, which for me is really fun. It was really fun to be able to kind of not be very precious about it. And those of you that are in the gallery might recognise the piece in this next one.
This one image reminds me of your opening image of the two little girls peering through.
So I am very interested in that idea of kind of aperture and peering in, and I haven't really revisited that until this animation, but that, I guess, framing as well, like throughout art history, landscape painting and representation is about framing and what we choose to frame and
defining what we look at.
and like fixing that focus, and like even now, like Google, you'll get a little camera symbol on your map that's like, this is where you want to go and take your photo. Like, we're still directing people.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, well, like come up as like,
Okay.
like this is a panorama, go here.
Okay, I'll to look out.
Yeah, or don't.
Yes, I'm thinking about, I can't remember, there's a French movement of tourism where you do the opposite, you take the photograph with your back to the monument and of everything.
Nice.
So
That's very French, I like that.
It's very French, isn't it? Which actually makes me think about this idea of a lot of your work is about plants growing up through cracks and fissures and the resilience. We saw that a lot in the Lambeth Wilds project in particular. And for me, we talked a little bit, or I alluded to it just before we started this formal conversation. I've been reading and studying a lot with a philosopher called Bayo Akamalafe, and he asked this question of what if our response to the crisis was part of the crisis that created more crisis? So in other words, he's saying, if we resist something, we're actually going to strengthen the thing that we're resisting. Like if I push against your hands, then you're going to push back harder. And so he says, to get out of that paradox in the complexity that we've got in this world at the moment, let's look for the cracks and the sidelines and the fissures and things where things can grow up through unexpectedly. So to me, there's a huge connection with your work, but I was curious again about what drew you to those perhaps often neglected or side spaces.
I think part of it is you asked me what does make me know about myself, but probably just like a stubbornness and a rebellion to do what's normal. But when I was making the work, so I first started making this botanical work on my MA, the RCA, and I had this idea that I was making work about a childhood memory, and I was making these kind of beautiful meadows, and they were all very dreamy and ethereal. And then I thought about, like, I don't actually remember being in a meadow when I was a child. Like, where's this memory come from? And I tried to think of, like, well, how did I interact with plants when I was little? And I remember sitting at the back of my garden where it was concrete and the bins were kept, and pulling blades of grass out and stripping all the grass seed off of them. And that was like my real childhood memory of nature. Yeah. And I was living in London at the time, so I then started looking for, like, well, where is, you know, we can't all travel to the Cairngorms and see these vast landscapes, so where is nature in the landscapes that the majority of us as humans live in? And that was when I started really focusing on kind of weeds growing through cracks in the pavement in London, but seeing like a real beauty in that, and kind of a lot of people commented that my work reminded them of Jura's turf, or mini turf, and like, there's like these amazing compositions that are happening within the cracks of the pavement that we walk past every day.
Spontaneously.
Yeah.
I'm going to take us on to a slightly different aspect. You talked about childhood memories. We saw 2 children at the beginning, and then of course we saw this wonderful picture of you breastfeeding your daughter while making. So a couple of questions on motherhood. First of all, how do you feel motherhood has changed your approach to your work, if it has?
It's made me have to be a lot more efficient.
And
I think that's why residencies have become so important, because I can't be in the studio till 10 p.m. working on things. So, and because I teach as well at Royal College of Art, and that's 3 days a week. So actually being able to dedicate that period of time to just focusing on developing ideas and thinking and being in a different place, and kind of that spaciousness. Residencies have become really important, and that's
to play as well.
And that kind of permission to play and experiment. And I would have thought that residencies would be harder as a parent, but actually I'm very lucky I've got the support of my own parents, so they very happily signed up to come to some nice different places with me, and look after my daughter. So that's become quite an important way of working. It becomes quite focused. I think when my daughter was first born, it did change the way I kind of was thinking about work. And I don't know if motherhood is like an overriding theme of my work, but I think it's always present because life is always present.
Yeah, and nurturing. So I'm interested because obviously there's been a lot of discourse in the last couple of years about artist mothers and other parents, actually, and think about Hetty Judah's work on that. And for me, I'm at a different stage of life. My son is grown up, but thinking about, I had the equivalent of, I would write when my son was sleeping, and I would work at whatever hours I could, so that then I could be with him as a baby, and then work. And now actually we've got a much more current conversation about the challenges, the way that motherhood can exclude people from practicing as artists.
Yeah.
And thinking about what might be successful models for the future. And I was wondering if you don't necessarily need to have, but whether you had any perspectives on that.
I think just the main thing is that childcare should be included in artists' fees to make that possible. And like accommodation provided so that additional caregivers can come. I mean, that's something that's been like practically very useful for me, but that's because I'm very lucky that I have my parents who are available to come and support that. But I think, factoring in childcare and being open to kind of more flexible hours. Like I know Hetty Judah has done events where they happen in the daytime and then you can bring your baby along. I think and just having the conversation as well. Like I remember when I was at college, if we had guest artists coming in, if they were a parent, that was kind of what I always wanted to know about, like those kind of real practicalities of how that can work.
Yeah. And then there's a conceptual, so that's the practical side where we just need to get with the programme. We just need to make it work practically. And then taking us from there to the kind of conceptual side, what Hetty Judah writes about and others is that for the longest time it was taboo really to talk about motherhood with it or deal with motherhood as part of one's artistic practice. Do you feel that's really changing?
I think the conversation is starting and things are quite slow, aren't they? And maybe that's why I feel much more comfortable talking about it and being very open about it. And because I've been supported by the galleries I work with as well, and they're kind of opening that conversation for me. I think maybe before I had my daughter, and that wasn't very long ago, I would have felt like I maybe needed to be more secretive about it. So hopefully that's a sign that things are slightly starting to shift.
I think they are. I'm pretty optimistic. I think we will start to wind up. Have you shown all your animations? You have.
Yeah.
So in terms of your work, you showed us some work that started to incorporate colour. That was a new direction because for the early part of your career, you were working very much in monochrome. I think you're moving further into colour. I would love to hear what's next.
I mentioned how I've just been sneaking these little bits of colour into the work, and you can see just a tiny touch of yellow in the centre of that one and a bit of green in the base. But actually, what the next exhibition I'm working on is an RCA research exhibition, which is called Colour Made Manifest. So that's being led by Steve Brown, one of my colleagues at the RCA, and we're part of a research group called the Material Engagements Research Cluster, and just thinking about how colour kind of plays out within materials. And so some of the work I didn't share here, but I've also been developing is kind of using clay to paint with, and using these small kind of daubs of clay in almost like a pointillist way. But then it's still very earthy. It's still kind of this palette of clay.
Yes.
And the colours have come from me blending different clays and like incorporating small amounts of stain or oxide, which is a way of colouring clay. So that's the next thing I'm working on, and I'm bringing that into the workshops I'm doing at the Garden Museum with Clay for Dementia. So I'm hoping to exhibit some of their work alongside mine. So really kind of bringing those two practices together much more closely.
And what's the response of those people that you're working with to working with colour?
So we had our first workshop of this series yesterday,
Right.
and I introduced this activity that, again, going back to childhood memories, that when I was younger, I used to get taken, our primary school, to go and visit a nature reserve, and we'd be given a small card with a little bit of sticky back plastic on it, I think in the shape of a Christmas tree, but I can't remember properly. And on our walk through the nature reserve, we'd have to pick out tiny little pieces of leaf or berry or anything we could find that would create a palette of colour on this bit of sticky back plastic. So we did that yesterday in the Garden Museum courtyard garden, and it, I mean, I guess this is why I love teaching so much, because I didn't know how participants would respond to that. And we had this just beautiful array of cards filled with these tiny spots of colour, and people noticing things that I hadn't noticed. Some people taking a completely abstract approach, and then others, they look like these beautiful kind of buttonholes where they've got leaves and arranged them. And so yeah, that was kind of the opening, and that's where I'm going to then build the rest of the project.
I can't wait to see how this really is. Fantastic. So Katie, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. It's really wonderful to really engage with you and to see your work. And I'm just going to ask if there are any questions. No questions. So in which case we will wind up, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie.
Actually, a quick moment, thank you both. Wow, that was insightful. That was so insightful in so many ways, and it took me down a road of memory and reminiscing over how we've known each other for so long, and you're picking up little weeds from the pavement of Old Street for the workshops that you were doing 5 years ago. So this has really taken me back in so many ways, and I feel I've learned so much more today. Amazing, wonderful questions. Like, it opened up a little world into her brain. So thank you so much. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for your time. And thank you.
Thank you for being here.